Today we turn to Kant's reply to Aristotle. Kant thinks that Aristotle just made a mistake. It's one thing, Kant says, to support a fair framework of rights within which people can pursue their own conceptions of the good life. It's something else, and something that runs the risk of coercion, to base law or principles of justice on any particular conception of the good life. You remember Aristotle says, in order to investigate the ideal constitution, we have first to figure out the best way to live. Kant would reject that idea. He says that constitutions and laws and rights should not embody or affirm or promote any particular way of life. That's at odds with freedom. For Aristotle, the whole point of law, the purpose of the polis, is to shape character, to cultivate the virtue of citizens, to inculcate civic excellence, to make possible a good way of life. That's what he tells us in the Politics. For Kant, on the other hand, the purpose of law, the point of the Constitution, is not to inculcate or to promote virtue. It's to set up a fair framework of rights within which citizens may be free to pursue their own conceptions of the good for themselves. So we see the difference in their theories of justice. We see the difference in their account of law, or the role of the Constitution, the point of politics. And underlying these differences are two different accounts of what it means to be a free person. For Aristotle, we're free insofar as we have the capacity to realize our potential. And that leads us to the question of fit. Fit between persons and the roles that are appropriate to them. Figuring out what I'm cut out for. That's what it means to lead a free life, to live up to my potential. Kant rejects that idea and instead substitutes his famously demanding notion of freedom as the capacity to act autonomously. Freedom means acting according to a law I give myself. Freedom as autonomy. Part of the appeal, part of the moral force of the view of Kant and of Rawls consists in the conception of the person as a free and independent self, capable of choosing his or her own ends. The image of the self as free and independent offers, if you think about it, a powerful, liberating vision, because what it says is that as free moral persons, we are not bound by any ties of history or of tradition or of inherited status that we haven't chosen for ourselves. And so we're unbound by any moral ties prior to our choosing them. And that means that we are free and independent sovereign selves. We're the authors of the only obligations that constrain us. The communitarian critics of Kantian and Rawlsian liberalism acknowledge that there is something powerful and inspiring in that account of freedom, the free, independent choosing self. But they argue it misses something. It misses a whole dimension of moral life and even political life. It can't make sense of our moral experience because it can't account for certain moral and political obligations that we commonly recognize and even prize. And these include obligations of membership, loyalty, solidarity, and other moral ties that may claim us for reasons that we can't trace to an act of consent. Alistair MacIntyre gives an account, what he calls a narrative conception of the self. It's a different account of the self. Human beings are essentially storytelling creatures, MacIntyre argues. That means I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question, of what story or stories do I find myself a part? That's what he means by the narrative conception of the self. What does this have to do with the idea of community and belonging? MacIntyre says this: once you accept this narrative aspect of moral reflection, you will notice that we can never seek for the good or exercise the virtues only as individuals. We all approach our circumstance as bearers of particular social identities. I am someone's son or daughter, a citizen of this or that city. I belong to this clan, that tribe, this nation. Hence, MacIntyre argues, what is good for me has to be the good for someone who inhabits these roles. I inherit from the past of my family, my city, my tribe, my nation, a variety of debts, inheritances, expectations, and obligations. These constitute the given of my life, my moral starting point. This is, in part, what gives my life its moral particularity. That's the narrative conception of the self. And it's a conception that sees the self as claimed or encumbered, at least to some extent, by the history, the tradition, the communities of which it's a part. We can't make sense of our lives, not only as a psychological matter, but also as a moral matter, in thinking what we ought to do without attending to these features about us. Now, MacIntyre recognizes that this narrative account, this picture of the encumbered self, puts his account at odds with contemporary liberalism and individualism. From the standpoint of individualism, I am what I myself choose to be. I may biologically be my father's son, but I can't be held responsible for what he did unless I choose to assume such responsibility. I can't be held responsible for what my country does or has done unless I choose to assume such responsibility. But MacIntyre says this reflects a certain kind of moral shallowness, even blindness. It's a blindness at odds with the full measure of responsibility, which sometimes he says involves collective responsibility, or responsibilities that may flow from historic memories. And he gives some examples. Such individualism is expressed by those contemporary Americans who deny any responsibility for the effects of slavery upon black Americans, saying, I never owned any slaves. Or the young German who believes that having been born after 1945 means that what Nazis did to Jews has no moral relevance to his relationship to his Jewish contemporaries. MacIntyre says all of these attitudes of historical amnesia amount to a kind of moral abdication. Once you see that who we are and what it means to sort out our obligations can't be separated, shouldn't be separated from the life histories that define us. The contrast, he says, with the narrative account is clear. For the story of my life is always embedded in the story of those communities from which I derive my identity. I am born with a past, and to try to cut myself off from that past is to deform my present relationships. So there you have, in MacIntyre, a strong statement of the idea that the self can't be detached, shouldn't be detached from its particular ties of membership, history, story, narrative. Now, I want to get your reactions to the communitarian critique of the individualist or the voluntarist, the unencumbered self. But let's make it concrete so that you can react to more than just the theory of it by looking at the two different accounts of moral and political obligation that arise, depending on which of these conceptions of the person one accepts. On the liberal conception, moral and political obligations arise in one of two ways. There are natural duties that we owe human beings as such, duties of respect for persons qua persons. These obligations are universal. Then, as Rawls points out, there are also voluntary obligations, obligations that we owe to particular others insofar as we have agreed, whether through a promise or a deal or a contract. Now, the issue between the liberal and communitarian accounts of the self, is there another category of obligation or not? The communitarian says there is. There is a third category that might be called obligations of solidarity or loyalty or membership. The communitarian argues that construing all obligations as either natural duties or voluntary obligations fails to capture obligations of membership or solidarity. Loyalties whose moral force consists partly in the fact that living by them is inseparable from understanding ourselves as the particular persons we are. What would be some examples? And then I want to see how you would react to them. Examples of obligations of membership that are particular, but don't necessarily flow from consent, but rather from membership, narrative, community, one situation. The most common examples are ones to do with the family. The relation between parents and children, for example. Suppose there were two children drowning. You could save only one of them. One was your child, the other was a stranger's child. Would you have an obligation to flip a coin? Or would there be something morally obtuse if you didn't rush to save your child? Now you may say, well, parents have agreed to have their children. So take the other case, the case of children's obligation for their parents. Now we don't choose our parents. We don't even choose to have parents. There is that asymmetry. And yet, consider two aging parents, one of them yours, the other a stranger's. Doesn't it make moral sense to think that you have a greater obligation to look after your aged parent than to flip a coin or to help the strangers. Now, is this traceable to consent? Not likely. Or take a couple of political examples. During World War II, French resistance pilots flew bombing raids over occupied France. One day, one of the pilots received his targets and noticed that the village he was being asked to bomb was his home village. He refused, not disputing that it was as necessary as the target he bombed yesterday. He refused on the ground that he couldn't bring himself. It would be a special moral crime for him to bomb his people, even in a cause that he supported, the cause of liberating France. Now, do we admire that? If we do, the communitarian argues, it's because we do recognize obligations of solidarity. Take another example. Some years ago, there was a famine in Ethiopia. Hundreds of thousands of people were starving. The Israeli government organized an airlift to rescue Ethiopian Jews. They didn't have the capacity to rescue everyone in Ethiopia, and they rescued several hundred Ethiopian Jews. Now, what's your moral assessment? Is that a kind of morally troubling partiality, a kind of prejudice, or, as the Israeli government thought, is there a special obligation of solidarity that this airlift properly responded to? Well, that takes us to the broader question of patriotism. What, morally speaking, is to be said for patriotism? There are two towns named Franklin. One is Franklin, Texas, and the other is just across the Rio Grande River, Franklin, Mexico. What is the moral significance of national boundaries? Why is it, or is it the case, that we as Americans have a greater responsibility for the health and the education and the welfare and public provision for people who live in Franklin, Texas, than equally needy people just across the river living in Franklin, Mexico? According to the communitarian account, membership does matter. And the reason patriotism is at least potentially a virtue is that it is an expression of the obligations of citizenship. How many are sympathetic to the idea that there is this third category of obligation, the obligations of solidarity or membership? How many are sympathetic to that idea? And how many are critical of that idea? How many think all obligations can be accounted for in the first two ways? All right, let's hear from the critics of the communitarian idea first. Yes?
My biggest concern with the idea of having obligations because you're a member of something or because of solidarity is that it seems that if you accept those obligations as being sort of morally binding, then there's a greater occurrence of overlapping obligations, a greater occurrence of good versus good. And I don't know if this sort of framework allows us to choose between them.
Good. And what's your name?
Patrick.
So you worry that if we recognize obligations of membership or solidarity, since we inhabit different communities, their claims might conflict. And what would we do if we have competing obligations? Yes?
Well, one solution is that we could view ourselves as ultimately members of the human community, and that then within that we have all these smaller spheres of that, you know, I am an American or I am a student at Harvard. And so the most important community to be obligated to is the community of human beings, and then from there you can sort of evaluate which other ones are most important to you.
So the most universal, and what's your name?
Nicola?
So Nicola, you say the most universal community we inhabit, the community of humankind, always takes precedence.
Yes.
Patrick, are you satisfied?
No.
Why not?
It seems rather arbitrary that we should choose the universal obligation over the more specific obligation. I might also say that I should be obligated first to the most specific of my obligations. For instance, take my family as a small unit of solidarity. Perhaps I should be first obligated to that unit, and then perhaps to the unit of my town, and then my country, and then the human race.
Good, thank you. I want to hear from another critic of the communitarian view. We have the objection, well, what if goods collide? Who objects to the whole idea of it? Who sees patriotism as just a kind of prejudice that ideally we should overcome? Yes?
Patriotism reflects a community membership. That's a given. I think the problem is that whereas some memberships are natural narratives, the narrative of citizenship is a constructed one, and I think a false one. Because as the river is just a historical accident, it makes no sense that because the lottery country of birth threw me into the United States as opposed to Mexico, that's the membership that I should be a part of.
Good. And what's your name?
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth. Who has a reply? Yes.
I think in general, we have to ask, where do our moral obligations arise from anyway? And I think basically there'd be two places from which they could arise. One would be kin, and another one would be reciprocity. And the closer you are associated to other people, there's a natural reciprocity there in terms of having interactions with those people. You interact with the neighbors on your street, with the other people in your country through economic arrangements.
But I don't know, and you don't know those people in Franklin, Texas, any more than you know the people in Franklin, Mexico, do you?
Presumably, you're naturally more connected with the people in your own country in terms of interaction and trade than you are with people in other countries.
Good. Who else? Well, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the basis for patriotism can be compared to like school spirit or even house spirit that we see here, where freshmen are sorted into houses and then within a day they have developed some sort of attachment or a pride associated with that house. And so I think that we can probably draw a distinction between a moral obligation for communitarian beliefs and sort of just a sentimental, emotional attachment.
Good. Wait, stay there. What's your name?
Rena.
What about, go back to my example about the obligation of the child to the parent. Would you say the same thing there? It's just may or may not be a sentimental tie, but it has no moral weight?
Well, I mean, I'm not entirely certain that accident in the initial stage is something that will preclude like moral obligations later. So, you know, just because we are randomly sorted into a house or just because we don't choose who our parents are or what country we're born into doesn't necessarily mean that we won't like develop an obligation based on some type of benefit, I guess. Just sort of shaking.
So your obligation to your aged parent that's greater than to aged parents around the world is only because, and insofar as, you're repaying a benefit that your parent gave you when you were growing up?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that if you look at cases of adoption where, you know, you have a biological parent somewhere else that you don't interact with, and then you have a parent, you know, who adopted you, most people would say that if you had to pick between them in the case of, you know, aging parents, that your obligation would lie more with the person who raised you and who had exchanges with you meaningfully.
May I ask you one more question about the parent?
Sure.
Do you think that a person with a bad parent owes them less?
I don't know, because I've never had a bad parent.
I think that's a good place to end.
Thank you.
We'll continue with this next time. Thank you.
If I were working on an ec problem set, for example,
I'd like to consider the strongest objections to the idea that there are obligations of solidarity or membership. Then I want to see if those objections can be met successfully. One objection emerged in the discussion last time. Patrick said, well, if obligations flow from community membership and identity, we inhabit multiple communities, doesn't that mean that our obligations will sometimes conflict? So that's one possible objection. And then Rena said, these examples meant to bring out the moral force of solidarity and membership. Examples about parents and children, about the French resistance fighter asked to bomb his own village and drawing back, about the airlift by Israel of Ethiopian Jews. These examples, they may be intuitively evocative, Rena said, but really they're pointing to matters of emotion, matters of sentiment, not true moral obligations. And then there were a number of objections, not necessarily to patriotism as such, but to patriotism understood as an obligation of solidarity and membership beyond consent. This objection allowed that there can be obligations to the communities we inhabit, including obligations of patriotism, but this objection argued that all of the obligations of patriotism or of community or membership are actually based on liberal ideas and perfectly compatible with them. Consent, either implicit or explicit, or reciprocity. Julia Rothau, for example, on the website, said that liberalism can endorse patriotism as a voluntary moral obligation. Patriotism and familial love both fall under this category. Because after all, Julia points out, the Kantian framework allows people free rein to choose to express virtues such as these if they want to. So you don't need the idea of a non-voluntary particular moral obligation to capture the moral force of community values. Where's Julia? Okay, so did I summarize that fairly? There is action. Julia actually is in line with what Rawls says about this very topic. You weren't aware of that. You came up with it on your own. That's pretty good. Rawls says, when he's discussing political obligation, he says it's one thing if someone runs for office or enlists in the military. They're making a voluntary choice. But Rawls says there is, I believe, no political obligation, strictly speaking, for citizens generally, because it's not clear what is the requisite binding action and who has performed it. So Rawls acknowledges that for ordinary citizens, there is no political obligation except insofar as some particular citizen willingly, through an act of consent, undertakes or chooses such an obligation. That's in line with Julia's point. It's related to another objection that people have raised, which is it's perfectly possible to recognize particular obligations to one's family or to one's country, provided honoring those obligations doesn't require you to violate any of the natural duties or requirements of universal respect for persons, qua persons. So that's consistent with the idea that we can choose, if we want to express a loyalty to our country or to our people or to our family, provided we don't do any injustice within the framework, acknowledging the priority, that is, of the universal duties. The one objection that I didn't mention is the view of those who say that obligations of membership really are a kind of collective selfishness. Why should we honor them? Isn't it just a kind of prejudice? So what I'd like to do, perhaps if those of you who have agreed, who wrote and who have agreed to press these objections, perhaps if you could gather down all together, we'll form a team as we did once before, and we'll see if you can respond to those who want to defend patriotism conceived as a communal obligation. Now, there were a number of people who argued in defense of patriotism as the communitarian view conceives it. So let me go down now and join the critics of communitarianism, if there's a microphone that we could use somewhere. Okay, thanks, Kate. Who, as the critics of patriotism, communal patriotism, gather their forces here? Patrick, if you want to, you can join as well, or Rena. Others who have spoken or addressed this question are free to join in. But I would like to hear now from those of you who defend patriotism and defend it as a moral obligation that can't be translated back into purely consent-based terms, can't be translated into liberal terms. Where's A.J. Kumar? A.J., everybody seems to know you. All right, let's hear from A.J. You said, in the same way I feel I owe more to my family than to the general community, I owe more to my country than to humanity in general. Because my country holds a great stake in my identity, it is not prejudice for me to love my country, unless it is prejudice for me to love my parents more than somebody else's. So, A.J., what would you say to this group? Stand up.
I think that there's some fundamental moral obligation that comes from a communitarian responsibility to people and groups that form your identity. I mean, even, I'll give the example that, there are a lot of things about our government right now that I'm not in favor of, but part of my identity is that America values a free society where we can object to certain things, and I think that's an expression of patriotism as well. And I go back to the parent example, or even at Harvard, I think, I owe more to my roommates because they make up my identity than I do to the Harvard community as a whole, and I think that applies to our country because there's certain things that growing up here, yes, we can't choose it, we can't choose our parents, things like that, but it makes up part of our identity.
Okay, who would like to take that on? Mike?
Yeah, about the obligation to others simply by virtue of being being influenced by them. I'm a German citizen, and if I'd been born 80 years earlier, then I would have been a citizen of Nazi Germany. And for some reason, I just don't think that I would have to feel obligated towards Germany because I had benefited from actions of Nazis.
I mean, I guess my response to that would be you have hundreds of thousands of protesters in the United States right now who hold up signs that say peace is patriotic. And I'm sure there are people in this room who don't agree with that. I personally do. And I would say that they're strongly objecting to basically everything the Bush administration is doing right now, but they still consider themselves loving their country because they're furthering the cause of what they see as best for the country. And I tend to agree with that as a patriotic movement.
Well, but how's that then? How do you still favor your country? How's that still patriotic? I mean, isn't that more a sentimental attachment? Where's the obligation there?
Yeah, not to bring us back to John Locke, but I'd like to bring us back to John Locke. So, I mean, in his conception of when people join society, there's still some outlet. Like if you're not satisfied with your society, you do have a means of exit. Even though we had a lot of concerns about how you're born in and it's not very feasible, he still provides that option. If we want to say that your obligation to society is a moral one, that means that prior to knowing exactly what that society is going to be like or what your position is going to be in that society, that means that you have a binding obligation to like a completely unknown body that could be completely foreign to all of your personal beliefs or what you would hold to be.
Do you think that kind of communal obligation or patriotism means writing the community a blank moral check?
Basically, yeah. Like I think that we can, I think it's reasonable to say that as you grow and as you develop within that community, that you acquire some type of obligation based on reciprocity. But to say that you have a moral obligation, I think, requires a stronger justification.
Who else? Anyone else like to address that?
I guess we could say that you could argue that you're morally obliged to society by the fact that there is this reciprocity. I think it's the idea that, you know, we participate in society, we pay our taxes, we vote. This is why we could say that we owe something to society. But beyond that, I don't think there's anything inherent in the fact that we are members of the society itself that we owe it anything. I think it's insofar as the society gives us something, gives us protection, safety, security, then we owe the society something, but nothing beyond what we give the society.
Who wants to take that on? Rahul?
I don't think we give the community a blank moral check in that sense. I think we only give it a blank moral check when we advocate our sense of civic responsibility and when we say that the debate doesn't matter because patriotism is a vice. I think that patriotism is important because it gives us a sense of community, a sense of common civic virtue that we can engage in the issues. Even if you don't agree with the way the government is acting, you can still love your country and hate the way it's acting. And I think because out of that love of country, you can debate with other people and have respect for their views, but still engage in the debate. If you just say that, you know, patriotism is a vice, you drop out of that debate and you cede the ground to people who are more fundamentalist, who have a stronger view, and who may coerce the community. Instead, we should engage the other members of the community on that same moral ground.
Well, now what we hear from AJ and Rahul is a very pluralistic, argumentative, critically minded patriotism, whereas what we hear from Ike and the critics of patriotism here is the worry that to take patriotic obligation in a communal way, seriously, involves a kind of loyalty that doesn't let us just pick and choose among the beliefs or actions or practices of our country. What's left of loyalty if all we're talking about, AJ and Rahul, if all we're talking about is loyalty to principles of justice that may happen to be embodied in our community or not, as the case may be, and if not, then we can reject its course. I don't know, I've sort of given a reply. I got carried away, I'm sorry. Who would like? Go ahead, Julia.
Yeah, I think that patriotism, you need to define what that is. It sounds like, you know, you would normally think that we were given a more weak definition here of patriotism amongst us, but it almost sounds like your definition is merely to have some sort of civic involvement in debating within your society. And I think that kind of undermines maybe some of the moral worth of patriotism as a virtue as well. I think if you can consent to a stronger form of patriotism if you want, that's a stronger, I guess, moral obligation than even what you're suggesting.
What we really need to sharpen the issue is an example from the defenders of communitarianism of a case where loyalty can actually compete with and possibly outweigh universal principles of justice. Isn't that that's the test they really need to meet, isn't it? All right. So that's the test you need to meet, or any among you who would like to defend obligations of membership or solidarity independent of ones that happen to embody just principles. Who has an example of a kind of loyalty that can and should compete with universal moral claims, respect for persons? Go ahead.
Yeah, if I were working on an EC problem set, for example, and I saw that my roommate was cheating, that might be a bad thing for him to do, but I wouldn't turn him in. You would not turn him in? I wouldn't turn him in, and I would argue that's the right thing to do because of my obligation to him. You know, it may be wrong, but that's what I would do, and you know, I think that's what most people would do as well.
All right, now there's a fair test. He's not slipping out by saying he's invoking in the name of community some universal principles of justice. What's your name? Stay there. What's your name?
It's Dan. Dan.
So what do people think about Dan's case? That's a harder case for the ethic of loyalty, isn't it? But a truer test? How many agree with Dan? So loyalty, Dan, loyalty has its part of sense. How many disagree with Dan? Peggy.
Oh, well, I agree with Dan, but I agree that it's a choice that we make, but it's not necessarily right or wrong. I mean, I'm agreeing that I'm going to make the wrong choice because I'm going to choose my roommate, but I also recognize that choice isn't morally right.
So you're still translating even Dan's loyalty. You're saying, well, that's a matter of choice. But what's the right thing to do? Most people put up their hands saying Dan would be right to stand by his roommate and not turn him in. Yes, go ahead.
Also, I think as a roommate, you have insider information, and that might not be something you want to use. That might be something unfair to hold against. You know, you're spending that much time with a roommate. Obviously, you're going to learn things about him, and I don't think it's fair to reveal that to a greater community.
But it's loyalty, Wojtek. You agree with Dan that
yes,
loyalty is the ethic at stake here?
Absolutely.
You don't have a duty to tell the truth? To report someone who cheated?
Not if you've been advantaged into getting that kind of information.
Before our critics of patriotism leave, I want to give you another version, a more public example of what I guess we should call it Dan's dilemma. Dan's dilemma of loyalty. And I want to get the reaction of people to this. This came up a few years ago in Massachusetts. Does anyone know who this man is? Billy Bulger, that's right. Who is Billy Bulger? He was president of the Massachusetts State Senate for many years, one of the most powerful politicians in Massachusetts. And then he became president of the University of Massachusetts. Now, Billy Bulger, did you hear the story about him that bears on Dan's dilemma? Billy Bulger has a brother named Whitey Bulger. And this is Whitey Bulger. His brother Whitey is on the FBI's most wanted list, alleged to be a notorious gang leader in Boston, responsible for many murders, and now a fugitive from justice. But when the U.S. attorney, they called Billy Bulger, then the president of the University of Massachusetts, before the grand jury and wanted information on the whereabouts of his brother, this fugitive, and he refused to give it. The U.S. attorney said, just to be clear, Mr. Bulger, you feel more loyalty to your brother than to the people of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts? And here's what Billy Bulger said. I never thought of it that way, but I do have a loyalty to my brother. I care about him. I hope that I'm never helpful to anyone against him. I don't have an obligation to help anyone catch my brother. Dan, you would agree? How many would agree with the position of Billy Bulger? Let me give one other example, and then we'll let the critics reply, the critics of loyalty, as we'll describe it. Here's an even more faithful example from a figure in American history, Robert E. Lee. Now, Robert E. Lee, on the eve of the Civil War, was an officer of the Union Army. He opposed secession, in fact, regarded it as treason. When war loomed, Lincoln offered Lee to be the commanding general of the Union Army, and Lee refused. And he described in a letter to his sons why he refused. With all my devotion to the Union, he wrote, I have not been able to make up my mind to raise my hand against my relatives, my children, my home. By which he meant Virginia. The Union is dissolved. I shall return to my native state and share the miseries of my people, save in her defense. I will draw my sword no more. Now here's a real test, Dan, for your principle of loyalty. Because here is the cause of the war against, not only to save the Union, but against slavery. And Lee is going to fight for Virginia, even though he doesn't share the desire of the southern states to secede. Now, the communitarian would say there is something admirable in that. Whether or not the decision was ultimately right, there's something admirable. And the communitarian would say, we can't even make sense. We can't make sense of Lee's dilemma as a moral dilemma unless we acknowledge that the claim of loyalty arising from his sense of narrative of who he is a moral, not just sentimental, emotional tug. All right, who would like to respond to Dan's loyalty, to Billy Bulger's loyalty, or to Robert E. Lee's loyalty to Virginia? What do you say, Julia?
Okay, well, I think that these are some classic examples of multiple spheres of influence, and that you have conflicting communities, that your family and your country. I think that's one reason why the idea of choice in your obligation is so important, because how else can you resolve this? If you're morally obligated and there's no way out of this need for loyalty to both communities, you're trapped. There's nothing you can do. You have to make a choice. And I think that being able to choose based on other characteristics and merely the arbitrary fact that you're a member of this community is important. Otherwise, it's left to, I guess, randomness.
Well, Julia, the issue isn't whether Dan makes a choice, or Billy Bulger or Robert E. Lee. Of course they make a choice. The question is on what grounds, on what principle should they choose? The communitarian doesn't deny that there's a choice to be made. The question is which choice, on what grounds, and should loyalty as such weigh? Andre, now you want to. All right, go ahead. What do you say?
Well, one of the things we've noticed in the three examples is that the people have all chosen the most immediate community of which they're a part, the more local one. And I think there's something to be said for that. It's not just random. There doesn't seem to be a conflict because they know which one is more important. And it's their family over the Ec-10 class, their state over their country, and their family over the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So I think that's the answer to which is more important.
You think that the local, the more particular is always the weightier morally, Andre?
Well, there seems to be a trend in the three cases. I would agree with that. I think most of us would agree that your family takes precedence over the United States, perhaps.
Which is why you go with Dan. Dan, yes. Loyalty to the roommate over Ec-10 and the truth.
Yeah, exactly. I would, because,
truth-telling, not the truth of Ec-10.
Yes.
All right, so we understand. Yes.
But on the same example, in terms of family, you had cases in the Civil War where brother was pitted against brother on both sides of the war, where they chose country instead of family. So I think the exact same war shows that different people have different means of making these choices, and that there is no one set of values or one set of morality that communitarians can stick to. And personally, I think that's the biggest problem with communitarians, that we don't have one set of standard moral obligations.
And tell me your name.
Samantha?
So Samantha, you agree with Patrick's point the other day, that there may be, if we allow obligations to be defined by community identification or membership, they may conflict, they may overlap, they may compete, and there is no clear principle. Andre says there's a clear principle, the most particular. The other day, Nicola, who was sitting over here, where's Nicola, said the most universal. You're saying, Samantha, the scale of the community as such can't be the decisive moral factor. So there has to be some other moral judgment. All right, let's let our critics of communal patriotism, let's express our appreciation and thank them for their having stood up and responded to these arguments. Find the issue. Let's turn to the implications for justice of the positions that we've heard discussed here. One of the worries underlying these multiple objections to the idea of loyalty or membership as having independent moral weight is that it seems to argue that there is no way of finding principles of justice that are detached from conceptions of the good life as they may be lived in any particular community. Suppose the communitarian argument is right. Suppose the priority of the right over the good can't be sustained. Suppose instead that justice and rights unavoidably are bound up with conceptions of the good. Does that mean that justice is simply a creature of convention, of the values that happen to prevail in any given community at any given time? One of the writings we have among the communitarian critics is by Michael Walzer. He draws the implications of justice this way. Justice is relative to social meanings. A given society is just if its substantive life is lived in a certain way, in a way that is faithful to the shared understandings of the members. So Walzer's account seems to bear out the worry that if we can't find independent principles of justice, independent that is from conceptions of the good that prevail in any given community, that we're simply left with justice being a matter of fidelity or faithfulness to the shared understandings or values or conventions that prevail in any given society at any given time. But is that an adequate way of thinking about justice? Well, let's take a look at a short clip from the documentary Eyes on the Prize. It goes back in the 1950s in the South. Here are some situated American Southerners who believe in the tradition, in the shared understandings of segregation. Listen to the arguments they make about loyalty and tradition, and see if they don't make you uneasy about tying arguments about justice to the shared understandings or traditions that prevail in any given society at the moment. Let's run the clip.
This land is composed of two different cultures, a white culture and a colored culture, and I've lived close to them all my life. But I'm told now that we've mistreated them and that we must change, and these changes are coming faster than I expected, and I'm required to make decisions on a basis of a new way of thinking, and it's difficult. It's difficult for me, it's difficult for all Southerners.
Well, there you have it. Narrative selves, situated selves, invoking tradition. Doesn't that show us that justice can't be tied to the shared understandings of goods that prevail in any given community at any given time? Or is there a way of rescuing that claim from this example? Think about that question, and we'll return to it next time. The narrative conception of the self and the idea of obligations of solidarity or membership that did not flow from consent, that claimed us for reasons unrelated to a contract or an agreement or a choice we may have made. And we were debating among ourselves whether there are any obligations of this kind, or whether all apparent obligations of solidarity and membership can be translated into consent or reciprocity or universal duty that we owe persons qua persons. And then there were those who defended the idea of loyalty and of patriotism, So the idea of loyalty and of solidarity and of membership gathered a certain kind of intuitive moral force in our discussion. And then, as we concluded, we considered what seems to be a pretty powerful counterexample to that idea, namely the film of those Southern segregationists in the 1950s. And they talked all about their traditions, their history, the way in which their identities were bound up with their life history. Do you remember that? And what flowed from that history, from that narrative sense of identity for those Southern segregationists? They said we have to defend our way of life. Is this a fatal or a decisive objection to the idea of the narrative conception of the self? That's the question we were left with. What I would like to do today is to advance an argument and see what you make of it. And let me tell you what that argument is. I would like to defend the narrative conception of the person as against the voluntarist conception. I would like to defend the idea that there are obligations of solidarity or membership. Then, I want to suggest that there being such obligations lends force to the idea, when we turn to justice, that arguments about justice cannot be detached after all from questions of the good. But I want to distinguish two different ways in which justice might be tied to the good and argue for one of them. Now, the voluntarist conception of the person of Kant and Rawls we saw was powerful and liberating. A further appeal is its universal aspiration. The idea of treating persons as persons, without prejudice, without discrimination. And I think that's what led some among us to argue that, okay, maybe there are obligations of membership, but they are always subordinate, they must always be subordinate to the duties that we have to human beings as such, the universal duties. But is that right? If our encompassing loyalty should always take precedence over more particular ones, then the distinction between friends and strangers should ideally be overcome. Our special concern for the welfare of friends would be a kind of prejudice, a measure of our distance from universal human concern. But if you look closely at that idea, what kind of a moral universe, what kind of moral imagination would that lead you to? The Enlightenment philosopher Montesquieu gives perhaps the most powerful and I think ultimately the most honest account of where this relentless universalizing tendency leads the moral imagination. Here's how Montesquieu put it. He said, "A truly virtuous man would come to the aid of the most distant stranger as quickly as to his own friend." And then he adds, listen to this, "If men were perfectly virtuous, they wouldn't have friends." But it's difficult to imagine a world in which persons were so virtuous that they had no friends, only a universal disposition to friendliness. The problem isn't simply that such a world would be difficult to bring about, that it's unrealistic. The deeper problem is that such a world would be difficult to recognize as a human world. The love of humanity is a noble sentiment, but most of the time, we live our lives by smaller solidarities. This may reflect certain limits to the bounds of moral sympathy, but more important, it reflects the fact that we learn to love humanity, not in general, but through its particular expressions. So these are some considerations. They're not knockdown arguments. But moral philosophy can't offer knockdown arguments, but considerations of the kinds that we've been discussing and arguing about all along. Well, suppose that's right. One way of assessing whether this picture of the person and of obligation is right is to see what are its consequences for justice. And here's where it confronts a serious problem. And here we go back to our Southern segregationists. They felt the weight of history. Do we admire their character, these segregationists who wanted to preserve their way of life? Are we committed to saying, if we accept the idea of solidarity and membership, are we committed to saying that justice is tied to the good in the sense that justice means whatever a particular community or tradition says it means, including those Southern segregationists? Here it's important to distinguish two different ways in which justice can be tied to the good. One is a relativist way. That's the way that says, to think about rights, to think about justice, look to the values that happen to prevail in any given community at any given time. Don't judge them by some outside standard. but instead conceive justice as a matter of being faithful to the shared understandings of a particular tradition. But there's a problem with this way of tying justice to the good. The problem is that it makes justice wholly conventional, a product of circumstance, and this deprives justice of its critical character. But there is a second way in which justice can be tied with or bound up with the good. On this second, non-relativist way of linking justice with conceptions of the good, principles of justice depend for their justification not on the values that happen to prevail at any given moment in a certain place, but instead on the moral worth or the intrinsic good of the ends rights serve. On this non-relativist view, the case for recognizing a right depends on showing that it honors or advances some important human good. This second way of tying justice to the good is not, strictly speaking, communitarian, if by communitarian you mean just giving over to a particular community the definition of justice. Now, what I would like to suggest that of these two different ways of linking justice to the good, the first is insufficient, because the first leaves justice the creature of convention. It doesn't give us enough moral resources to respond to those Southern segregationists who invoke their way of life, their traditions, their way of doing things. But if justice is bound up with the good in a non-relativist way, there's a big challenge, a big question to answer. How can we reason about the good? What about the fact that people hold different conceptions of the good, different ideas about the purposes of key social institutions, different ideas about what social goods and human goods are worthy of honor and recognition? We live in a pluralist society. People disagree about the good. That's one of the incentives to try to find principles of justice and rights that don't depend on any particular ends or purposes or goods. So is there a way to reason about the good? Before addressing that question, I want to address a slightly easier question. Is it necessary? Is it unavoidable when arguing about justice to argue about the good? And my answer to that question is yes, it's unavoidable. It's necessary. So for the remainder of today, I want to try to advance that claim, that reasoning about the good, about purposes and ends, is an unavoidable feature of arguing about justice. It's necessary. Let me see if I can establish that. And for that, I'd like for us to begin a discussion of same-sex marriage. Now, same-sex marriage draws on, implicates, deeply contested and controversial ideas, morally and religiously. And so there's a powerful incentive to embrace a conception of justice or of rights that doesn't require the society as a whole to pass judgment one way or another on those hotly contested moral and religious questions about the moral permissibility of homosexuality, about the proper ends of marriage as a social institution. So clearly, if there's an incentive to resolve this question, to define people's rights in a way that doesn't require the society as a whole to sort out those moral and religious disputes, that would be very attractive. So what I would like to do now is to see, using the same-sex marriage case, whether it's possible to detach one's views about the moral permissibility of homosexuality and about the purpose, the end of marriage, to detach those questions from the question of whether the state should recognize same-sex marriage or not. So let's begin. I would like to begin by hearing the arguments of those who believe that there should be no same-sex marriage, but that the state should only recognize marriage between a man and a woman. Do I have volunteers? I had two. There were two people I asked, people who had voiced their views already on the Justice blog, Mark Luff and Ryan McCaffrey. Where are you? Okay. Mark, and where's Ryan? All right. Let's go first to Mark.
I have sort of teleological understanding of the purpose of sex and the purpose of marriage. And I think that for people like myself who are a Christian and also a Catholic, the purpose of sex is, one, for its procreative uses, and two, for a unifying purpose between a man and a woman within the institution of marriage.
You have a certain conception of the purpose, or the telos, of human sexuality, which is bound up with procreation,
right,
as well as union.
Yeah.
And the essence of marriage, the purpose of marriage as a social institution, is to give expression to that telos and to honor that purpose, namely the procreative purpose of marriage. Is that a fair summary of your view?
Yeah.
Where's Ryan? Go ahead. Do you agree more or less with Mark's reasons?
Yes, I agree. I think that the ideal of marriage involves procreation, And it's fine that, you know, homosexuals would go off and cohabitate with each other, but the government doesn't have a responsibility to encourage that.
All right, so the government should not encourage homosexual behavior by conferring the recognition of marriage.
Yeah, it would be wrong to outlaw it, but encouraging it is not necessary.
Who has a reply? Yes. Hannah?
I'd just like to ask a question to Mark. Let's say you got married to a woman, you did not have sex with her before marriage, and then when you became married, it became evident that you were an infertile couple. Do you think that it should be illegal for you to engage in sex if children will not result from that act?
Yeah, I think that it is moral, and that's why I gave the twofold purpose. So like a woman, say, I think older couples can get married, a woman who's beyond, who's already had menopause, and who can't have a child, because I think that sex has it has purposes beyond procreation.
I hate to be uncouth, but have you ever engaged in masturbation?
Yeah. You don't have to answer that. You can.
Oh, yeah, I think. All right.
Just a minute. No. Why?
I'd like to respond to that.
No, I think. Wait. Look, we've done pretty well over a whole semester, and we're doing pretty well now dealing with questions that most people think can't even be discussed in a university setting. And Hannah, you have a powerful point. Make that point as a general argument rather than as an interrogative. Okay. But make the point. What's the principle that you're appealing? Okay. What's the argument you have in mind?
All right. Well, biblically,
put it in the third person.
Yeah. Okay.
Rather than in the second person. Make the argument. Go ahead.
Okay. Biblically, masturbation or onanism is not permissible because it's spilling your seed on the earth when it's not going to result in the birth of a child. But what I'm saying is, you're saying that sex, there's something wrong with sex if it doesn't produce children or reinforce the marriage bond. Right. But then how can you say that there's something wrong, that, masturbation is permissible if masturbation obviously is not going to, create a child?
Yeah, I think marriage is society's way to create this separate institution where they say, this is what we hold as a virtue. Yes, every day we fall short, and people fall short in so many different other ways. But I think that if you personally fall short in some moral sphere, as we all do, that doesn't take the right of you to argue.
All right, I want you to stay there. I want to bring in some other voices, and we'll continue. Stay there if you would. Go ahead.
I think that the response to the masturbation...
Wait, tell us your name.
My name's Steve.
Steve, go ahead.
All right, the response to the masturbation issue is it's not something that's permissible. I don't think anyone will argue that homosexual sex is impermissible. It's just that society has no place in letting you marry yourself if masturbation is something that you do.
All right, Hannah. All right, Steve has drawn... All right, that's a good argument. Steve has drawn our attention to the fact that there are two issues here. One of them is the moral permissibility of various practices. The other is the fit between certain practices, whatever their moral permissibility, with the honor or recognition that the state should accord in allowing marriage. So Steve has a pretty good counter-argument. What do you say to Steve?
Well, I think that it's clear that human sexuality is something that is, inherent in, I believe, most people. And it's not something you can avoid. And masturbation, yeah, you can't marry yourself, but I don't think that takes away from the fact that, homosexuals are people too. And I can't understand why they wouldn't be able to marry each other. If you want to marry yourself, I don't know if you can legally do that. That's fine, but I don't...
Wait. Now, here we're deliberating as if legislators, what the law should be.
Okay.
So you said, Steve, that's fine. Does that mean as a legislator you would vote for a law of marriage that would be so broad that it would let people marry themselves?
Well, that's really beyond the pale of, anything that would really happen, but I don't think that...
But in principle?
Yeah, in principle?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. If Steve wants to marry himself, I'm not going to stop him.
I think
and you would confer state recognition on that solo marriage? And while we're at it, what about consensual polygamous marriages?
I actually think that if the male and the female are... that if the wives and the man and the husband, or the husbands and the wife are consenting, it should be permissible.
Who else? I know there are a lot of people who... Yes, okay, down here. Stand up and tell us your name.
Victoria.
Victoria.
So we're talking about the theological reasoning here for marriage, but I think the problem is that we're talking about it within the Catholic viewpoint, whereas the theological and the point to marriage for another religion or someone who's an atheist could be completely different. And the government doesn't have a right to impose the theological reasoning for Catholicism on everyone in the state, which is what my problem is with not allowing same-sex marriage. Because, your beliefs are your beliefs, and that's fine. But civil union is not marriage within the Catholic Church. And the state has a right to recognize a civil union between whoever it wants, but does not have a right to impose the beliefs of a certain minority or majority or whoever it is based on a religion within our state.
All right, Victoria, good. A question. Do you think the state should recognize same-sex marriage or just civil unions as something short of marriage?
Well, I think that the state doesn't have a right to recognize it as marriage within a church because that is not their place. But whereas civil union, I see civil union as essentially the same thing, except not under a religion, and the state has a right to recognize a civil union.
All right, so Victoria's argument is that the state should not try to decide the question of what the telos of marriage is. That's only something that religious communities can decide. Who else?
My point is, I don't see why we feel like state should recognize marriages at all. So I'm like one of these 70 people who voted state should not recognize any marriages because I believe it is a union between a male and a female, or two males or two females. But there's no reason to like ask state to give permission to me to unite myself. And some might say that like if state recognizes these marriages, it will help children. It will have a binding effect. But in reality, I don't think it actually has a binding effect.
All right, tell us your name.
Cezanne.
So Victoria and Cezanne's comments differ from earlier parts of the conversation. They say the state shouldn't be in the business of honoring or recognizing or affirming any particular telos or purpose of marriage or of human sexuality. And Cezanne is among those who says, therefore, maybe the state should get out of the business of recognizing marriage at all. Here's the question. Unless you adopt Cezanne's position, no state recognition of any kind of marriage, is it possible to choose between, to decide the question of same-sex marriage without taking a stand on the moral and religious controversy over the proper telos of marriage? Thank you very much to all of you who have participated. We'll pick this up next time. You did a great job. Who argued we shouldn't try to decide this question. We shouldn't, at least at the level of the state, at the level of law, try to come to any agreement on those questions about the good, because we live in a pluralist society where people have different moral and religious convictions. And so we should try to make law and the framework of rights neutral with respect to these competing moral and religious views. Now, it's interesting that some others, who favor the idea of neutrality, argued not in favor of restricting marriage to a man and a woman, nor in favor of permitting same-sex marriage. They argued, in the name of neutrality, for a third possibility, which is that government get out of the business of recognizing any kind of marriage. That was the third possibility. Now, Andrea Mayrose had an interesting contribution to this debate. She had a rejoinder to people who argue for neutrality. Where is Andrea? All right. Andrea, would you be willing, share with us the view, we can get you a microphone. Share with us your view. Why do you think that it's a mistake for the state to try to be neutral on moral and even religious questions like same-sex marriage?
I don't know that it is possible because people's lives are completely embedded in how they view the world, and maybe I just agree with Aristotle that the role of the government is helping people live in a sort of, like having a collective understanding of what is wrong and what is right.
Is it possible, and one could ask the same question of abortion that we've been asking of same-sex marriage. Do you think it's possible to decide whether abortion should be permitted or prohibited without taking a stand or making a judgment about the moral permissibility of abortion?
No, I don't think it is, and I think that's why it's such a controversy, because people are so deeply committed to like their fundamental beliefs about whether a fetus is a life or if it isn't. So if I believe that a fetus is a living being and has rights and has like fundamentally the right to live, then it's very hard for me to say, but I can put that aside and let you do what you want, because that's like me saying, well, despite my beliefs, I'm going to let you commit what to me is murder. So, and I mean, that's just
all right,
one.
and the analogy in the same-sex marriage case is, you said you're a defender of same-sex marriage.
Yes.
But you only came to that view once you were persuaded on the underlying moral question.
Right. Well, I think particularly in the U.S., so many people's beliefs are driven by their religious beliefs. And like Mark the other day, I'm Christian, I'm Catholic, and I had to decide for myself, like on a lot of thought, a lot of prayer, a lot of conversations with other people, that I disagreed with the Catholic standpoint that homosexuality itself isn't a sin. And once I came to that sort of conclusion in my personal relationship with God, like, I mean, that sounds hokey, right? That's like, oh, religious. But a lot of people are religious, and that's where they draw their beliefs and their views from. That's when I could say, yeah, I'm down with the state saying, go same-sex marriage, because I'm okay with that, and right. I think that's morally okay.
Good, thank you. Now, who would like to reply? If you can perhaps hang on there for a moment. Who would like to reply to Andrea's idea that in order to decide the question of same-sex marriage, it's necessary to sort out the question about the moral status of homosexuality and figuring out the purpose, the telos, the proper end of marriage? Who disagrees with Andrea on that point? Yes.
Well, I think you absolutely can separate your moral opinion and what you think the law should be. For example, I think abortion is unequivocally morally wrong, but I do not believe that illegalizing abortion makes it go away. I don't believe illegalizing abortion stops it, and therefore I am pro-choice, and I do believe the woman should have the choice, as it gives them more safety, just as maybe morally I don't want to get married to a man, but I'm not going to try to, impede someone else's freedom to do what they wish to do in terms of the law.
Andrea?
Whether the law makes something legal or illegal it's implicitly approving or disapproving something. So if you say, like, by making abortion legal, we're saying it's okay. As a society, collectively, we're saying it's okay with us in our society to abort a fetus. If we make it legal, if we make it illegal, then we're saying collectively as a society, it's not okay. And that's why society said it's illegal.
Tell us your name before.
My name is Daniel.
Daniel, what do you say?
Are we saying collectively that it's okay? Or are we saying that collectively we don't want women who are going to have an abortion anyway to go to clinics in the side alleys and have unsafe conditions?
All right, bring it to the same-sex marriage case. Why don't you have to decide that which position you're in favor of same-sex marriage, Daniel, being legally permitted?
I think it absolutely should be legally permitted because it's not something telling me that I need to marry a man. I absolutely don't see, if two men are consenting adults and want to get married, I don't see how I could even object to that.
All right, there's no harm.
There's no harm done either way, even if it is morally wrong according to me.
All right, let me turn to the way the Massachusetts court, who made this landmark ruling in the same-sex marriage case, grappled with the very issue that Andrea and Dan have been discussing here. Thanks to both of you very much. What did the court say? This was in the Goodridge case, which required the state of Massachusetts to extend marriage to same-sex couples. The court started out, well, the court was conflicted. If you read that opinion carefully, the court was conflicted as between the two positions we've just been hearing, defended by Andrea and by Dan. The court begins, and this is Chief Justice Margaret Marshall's opinion, it begins with an attempt at liberal neutrality. Many people hold deep-seated religious, moral, and ethical convictions that marriage should be limited to the union of one man and one woman, and that homosexual conduct is immoral. Many hold equally strong religious, moral, and ethical convictions that same-sex couples are entitled to be married, that homosexual persons should be treated no differently than their heterosexual neighbors. This is the court. Neither view answers the question before us. What is at stake is, quote, respect for individual autonomy and equality under law. At stake is an individual freely choosing the person with whom to share an exclusive commitment. In other words, at issue is not the moral worth of the choice, but the right of the individual to make it. So this is the liberal neutral strand in the court opinion, voluntary strand, the one that emphasizes autonomy, choice, consent. But the court seemed to realize that the liberal case, the neutral case, for recognizing same-sex marriage doesn't succeed, doesn't get you all the way to that position. Because if it were only a matter of respect for individual autonomy, if government were truly neutral on the moral worth of voluntary intimate relationships, then it should adopt a different policy, which is to remove government and the state altogether from according recognition to certain associations, certain kinds of unions, rather than others. If government really must be neutral, then the consistent position is what we here have been describing as the third position, the one defended in the article by Michael Kinsley, who argues for the abolition of marriage, at least as a state function. Perhaps a better term for this is the disestablishment of religion. This is Kinsley's proposal. He points out that the reason for the opposition to same-sex marriage is that it would go beyond neutral toleration and give same-sex marriage a government stamp of approval. That's at the heart of the dispute. In Aristotle's terms, at issue here is the proper distribution of offices and honors, a matter of social recognition. Same-sex marriage can't be justified on the basis of liberal neutrality or non-discrimination or autonomy rights alone, because the question at stake in the public debate is whether same-sex unions have moral worth, whether they're worthy of honor and recognition, and whether they fit the purpose of the social institution of marriage. So, Kinsley says, you want to be neutral? Then let churches and other religious institutions offer marriage ceremonies. Let department stores and casinos get into the act if they want to. This is Kinsley. Let couples celebrate their union in any way they choose and consider themselves married whenever they want. And if 3 people want to get married, or if one person wants to marry himself or herself, and someone else wants to conduct a ceremony for them and declare them married, let them. If you and your government are implicated, what do you care? This is Kinsley. But this is not the position that the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts wanted. They didn't call for the abolition or for the disestablishment of marriage. The court did not question government's role in conferring social recognition on some intimate associations rather than others. To the contrary, the court waxes eloquent about marriage as, quote, one of our community's most rewarding and cherished institutions. And then it goes on to expand the definition of marriage to include partners of the same sex. And in doing so, it acknowledges that marriage is more than a matter of tolerating choices that individuals make. It's also a matter of social recognition and honor. As Justice Marshall wrote, in a real sense, there are 3 partners to every civil marriage, 2 willing spouses, and an approving state. Marriage is at once a deeply personal commitment, but also a highly public celebration of the ideals of mutuality, companionship, intimacy, fidelity, and family. This is the court. Now, this is reaching well beyond liberal neutrality. This is celebrating and affirming marriage as an honorific, as a form of public recognition. And therefore, the court found that it couldn't avoid the debate about the telos of marriage. Justice Marshall's opinion considers and rejects the notion that the primary purpose of marriage is procreation. She points out that there's no requirement that applicants for a marriage license who are heterosexuals attest to their ability or their intention to conceive children. Fertility is not a condition of marriage. People who cannot stir from their deathbed may marry. So she advances all kinds of arguments along the lines that we began last time about what the proper and the essential nature of the telos of marriage is. And she concludes, not procreation, but the exclusive and permanent commitment of the partners to one another is the essential point and purpose of marriage. Now, nothing I've said about this court opinion is an argument for or against same-sex marriage, but it is an argument against the claim that you can favor or oppose same-sex marriage while remaining neutral on the underlying moral and religious questions. So all of this is to suggest that, at least in some of the hotly contested debates about justice and rights that we have in our society, the attempt to be neutral, the attempt to say it's just a matter of consent and choice and autonomy, we take no stand, that doesn't succeed. Even the court, which wants to be neutral on these moral and religious disputes, finds that it can't. What then about our second question? If reasoning about the good is unavoidable in debates about justice and rights, is it possible? If reasoning about the good means that you must have a single principle or rule or maxim or criterion for the good life that you simply plug in every time you have a disagreement about morality, then the answer is no. But having a single principle or rule is not the only way, not the best way of reasoning either about the good life or about justice. Think back to the arguments that we've been having here about justice and about rights, and sometimes about the good life. How have those arguments proceeded? They've proceeded very much in the way that Aristotle suggests, moving back and forth between our judgments about particulars, particular cases, events, stories, questions, back and forth between our judgments about particular cases and more general principles that make sense of our reasons for the positions we take on the particular cases. This dialectical way of doing moral reasoning goes back to the ancients, to Plato and Aristotle, but it doesn't stop with them, because there is a version of Socratic or dialectical moral reasoning that is defended with great clarity and force by John Rawls in giving an account of his method of justifying a theory of justice. You remember, it's not only the veil of ignorance in the principles that Rawls argues for. It's also a method of moral reasoning about justice that he calls reflective equilibrium. What is the method of reflective equilibrium? It's moving back and forth between our considered judgments about particular cases and the general principles we would articulate to make sense of those judgments. And not just stopping there, because we might be wrong in our initial intuitions. Not stopping there, but then sometimes revising our particular judgments in the light of the principles once we work them out. So sometimes we revise the principles, sometimes we revise our judgments and intuitions in the particular cases. The general point is this, and here I quote Rawls: a conception of justice can't be deduced from self-evident premises. Its justification is a matter of the mutual support of many considerations, of everything fitting together into one coherent view. And later in A Theory of Justice he writes, moral philosophy is Socratic. We may want to change our present considered judgments once their regulative principles are brought to light. Well, if Rawls accepts that idea and advances that notion of reflective equilibrium, the question we're left with is, he applies that to questions of justice, not to questions of morality and the good life. And that's why he remains committed to the priority of the right over the good. He thinks the method of reflective equilibrium can generate shared judgments about justice and the right, but he doesn't think they can generate shared judgments about the good life, about what he calls comprehensive moral and religious questions. And the reason he thinks that is that he says that in modern societies there is a fact of reasonable pluralism about the good. Even conscientious people who reason well will find that they disagree about questions of the good life, about morality and religion. And Rawls is likely right about that. He's not talking about the fact of disagreement in pluralist societies. He's also suggesting that there may be persisting disagreements about the good life and about moral and religious questions.